I really appreciate the opportunity to co-host this event. My name is Kristen Robinson. I'm the head of advocacy at Open Contracting Partnership, and we are co-hosting this event today with International Budget Partnership. I have 4 esteemed panelists with me today here at this side event for the Financing for Development Conference. FFD4 is a once-in-a-decade chance to reframe and improve how we approach economic and social development based on the evidence of what's worked and also what hasn't to date. We all know that public trust is essential to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and there's been a lot of conversation about public trust today and this whole week throughout the second preparatory conference to the FFD. And everyone on this panel believes very strongly that citizens need to see how their taxes are spent, and not only that these are being safeguarded from fraud, corruption, or mismanagement, but also that they are being spent in alignment with what the public really wants and needs, and that the public has a say and a voice in that process and in those decisions. That's not just about what or how much we spend, it's also about how we spend it. At Open Contracting Partnership, we look at procurement in particular. That's $13 trillion that is spent every year around the world. When we look at the gap in development financing, imagine what $13 trillion could do if it was spent in a way that promoted gender equality, that was advancing our environment and climate goals, our equity goals, including SMEs, creating quality jobs, and promoting public participation and a voice for the public in how those funds are spent. So I have 4 panelists with me here today. We will hear from Arantxa Guillen-Montero, Senior Governance and Public Administration Officer at the Division for Public Institutions and Digital Government at UNDESA. We will hear from Gabriel Okeowo, the Country Director of Budget Nigeria. We'll hear from Gilbert Sendugwa, Executive Director of the African Freedom of Information Center, and Mélène Niang, the Country Manager for Senegal from the International Budget Partnership. And we really want to discuss amongst our speakers how, from the point at agreeing the budget through to the expenditure, including on public procurement, which makes up $1 in every $3 spent by governments worldwide, can be used more effectively, and how we can make sure that the support through the FFD and through the multilateral development banks isn't creating parallel systems that are not locally owned, but is instead being really used as a chance for local ownership, public participation, and spending that money in line with the Sustainable Development Goal values. So I'm going to start by asking each of our speakers to tell us a bit about the work you're doing on budgets, expenditure, procurement, and public financial management, and how you think it can help strengthen the FFD process and outcome document. And I will start with Gabriel, please.
Thank you very much, Christine. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being part of this conversation this morning. As Christine introduced, my name is Gabriel Okeowo. I'm the Country Director for Budget Foundation Nigeria. Budget is a civic tech organization that works to promote civic education, promotes access to data, and participatory governance. Particularly around budgets, we work to promote fiscal governance. And we work in the whole value chain of the budget process. Okay. We work in the whole value chain of the budget process from the start point of budget preparation. We work with the proposed budget to the point where budget implementation is being implemented, and also track the implementation of the budget, as it were. And in terms of finance for development, this is critical because budget is an economic plan, is a planning document for the government to show what they intend to do for their citizens. And if we talk about development, I think budget is one reference document that can show the commitment of any government to the development of its people and development of the sovereignty of the geographical space that they manage. And quite a number of issues to deal with in that whole chain. One is to see that there is access to information, and not just access, or there is availability of information, but not just availability, but there is also access, right? And when we talk about access, we then want to be sure that information is not just available, but this information is comprehensible, is actionable, for citizens to follow and to be able to see what it's in need for them, right? And I'm sure in the course of this conversation, we will then be able to talk about, if I will have the opportunity to talk about the efficiency of that whole process of revenue generation, expenditure, spending, procurement process, right? Because in the climate where I came from, procurement fraud is still very big as one of the major, loophole in the whole budget process, right? A lot of fraud and corrupt activities that happened in terms of in government, mostly around procurement, right? And if we are going to talk about development, procurement is going to come into focus because a lot of development plans also have a procurement component to them. Either you are training, or you are building, or you are providing social services. They are all within procurement value chain, and there is need to really own that process and be sure that they really deliver the intent of government. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gabriel, and thank you for drawing the through line from budget to procurement. I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Milen, who is with us online, to tell us a little bit more about the budget side and the work that he is doing in Senegal.
Yes, thanks very much. So, Milen from the International Budget Partnership. Indeed, I am the country manager for Senegal, but also covering work in Francophone Africa. So thanks for inviting us. And I think this is a very interesting topic. At the International Budget Partnership, our focus is making sure that public funds are used effectively for programs and services that improve the lives of the people, mainly the most vulnerable and marginalized. And in our work, the question of procurement linked to budget credibility plays a very important role. And allow me to just share some points around our assessment of the global financing framework and the reason why procurement is very important to it before I get to how we do it. So our assessment of the question has been that the global financial architecture has not been able, unfortunately, to support the mobilization of stable and long-term financing at scale. And how does that translate at the country level? We have high borrowing costs in African countries. Most of our resources are being dedicated to debt servicing, and this is a reduced opportunity to invest in fundamental rights such as health, education, and sanitation. While we're still adjusting, to shocks around climate, while we are still trying to address gender imbalances, we still have other challenges at the resource mobilization side, around tax avoidance, tax evasion, illicit financial flows, but unfortunately, the inability of local systems to deliver, in their mandate in, resource mobilization. So why is procurement important? While we speak a lot about the resources that we don't have, we don't speak enough about the resources that we have and how they are being spent. So that is the reason why at IBP, we link the question of procurement and credibility. And we give also that question a very central role in the work we do. We've realized that in our focus of making sure that public resources are used effectively for programs and services that will benefit the poor and vulnerable, that a lot of governments are not spending their resources appropriately. And when I say that the resources are not being spent appropriately, on the one hand, we have high levels of underspent, which I will come back to. And on the other hand, we have weak oversight, which result in no services or poor services in a lot of sectors that we have monitored. So what we do is we try and bring the vulnerable people through social movements, organizations, in the whole process, in the whole procurement process. From the planning process, making sure that the public resources are used in line with the needs that are expressed by the communities, the final beneficiaries. We look at budget execution, so the budget execution rates, are the resources being implemented or not. And we also look at the outputs of the public procurements. So are we getting the resources to the people? Are the services being available, and are they being available in a good quality? And one thing we have noted is that we have a lot of bottlenecks that prevent those resources from getting to the poorest and most vulnerable. And what we have identified as causes to the situation are a lack of transparency, a lack of information, but also a lack of inclusivity of the procurement process. While in countries like Senegal, we are working on sustainable procurement, we try and mainstream issues like gender, issues like climate, but also various sorts of intersectionalities into the public discourse, but also in the areas that we open for governments to collaborate with citizens. Just let me share one small example around Francophone Africa. As I said earlier, we have high levels of underspent. If I take the case of Senegal, from 2018 to 2021, we've had close to 20% of underspent in a sector that is a critical sector, which is flood prevention and sanitation services. Resulting in resources not being available, on time, and flood management not being implemented in the right way, and then millions of people in informal settlements being subject to floods and the negative outputs of poor sanitation. And one thing that I would like to raise before I hand it over back to you is the role we should give to the role we should play in overseeing the work that the public sector, the private sector is doing. The reason being that a lot of this, the services that the government is now supposed to provide are being outsourced. They are outsourced through public procurement. And one reality that we have seen is there is weak oversight of those services from citizens, but also from the government side, resulting in a low level of regulation and services not always being what they are supposed to be. So I'm sure on the next points we will have further opportunities to elaborate on more concrete examples.
Great. Thank you so much for that contribution, Milen, and for really bringing in also the planning phase of public procurement. And it's so important that our procurement plan mirrors the budget plan, and that's one of the key ways we can make sure there is credibility with the public from the budget through to expenditure. I'm going to hand over now to Gilbert in Uganda, who will share a little bit more with us about what AFIC is doing in bringing in civil society organizations to monitor public contracts.
Thank you very much, and warm greetings from Kampala, Uganda. My name is Gilbert Sendugwa. I work with the African Freedom of Information Center, which is a network now of 56 organizations from 29 African countries. And as you may know, over the past 2 decades, public expenditure across the continent has multiplied several-fold. However, the quality and quantity of services has not changed. And in fact, in some of the cases, these have declined. So what we do at the Africa Freedom of Information Center and our members is to promote value for money in the public contracts, in budgets, and in the delivery of social services. We, based on the work that we do from monitoring of these contracts and services, strengthen the quality of dialogue between citizens and governments, and promote responsiveness and government action on those citizen feedback. We have done a lot of research and policy advocacy in the areas of work that we do around public access to information, transparency and accountability, inclusion of women and other marginalized groups, and also climate justice. And then we have also monitored the execution of donor-funded projects, for example, the World Bank, on the implementation of their civic engagement commitments to see whether or not these are reflected in project design and ultimately implementation. Let me give some of the examples of just to elaborate around this work. In respect to access to information, now we have 29 African countries that have adopted respective national access to information laws, but then citizens do not access this information around government projects, government services, and contracts, and this undermines value for money, among others. And what we have done, for example, is to train citizens on and civic groups on how to use these frameworks to access information and use it in service delivery. In Uganda, for example, Masaka district, community members around Mpugwe were not receiving medical services. Each time they would go for treatment for malaria, they would be told that there is no medicine. One of the citizens we trained, Margaret Musoke, made an information request for the number of deliveries in the past 12 months and how many doses of malaria medicine in each of these deliveries. Documents revealed that actually there was a regular supply at that health center, and yet they were being told that there was no medicine. So she demanded that this should be put on the notes board of the health facility, and there was no reported absence of medicine. So it matters for citizens to access information. In Kenya, Busia district, government made an intervention to keep girls in schools and initiated a program to provide sanitary pads. The contractor was engaged, but 2 years on, schools were not getting these sanitary pads. Again, a beneficiary of our training, CSO, did make an information request, and documents revealed that actually the contract was not being implemented. The district commissioner was then engaged and required that this contractor must supply the things that government had paid for. In Marawi Kasungu district, there was a contract to supply textbooks to schools. Again, for a whole year, the contractor was paid but had not delivered. What was funny is that this contractor had a shop of electrical materials, not textbooks. So we don't know how that was, selected. But what is important is that upon receiving this feedback, government required this contractor to supply the textbooks. Let me talk about another work that we do around monitoring of contracts and services. With our members, we trained and deployed community monitors in Ghana, Uganda, Nigeria, Malawi, and Kenya. And we trained them on accessing government information, and then how to interpret it and use it to monitor government contracts. What was great was that governments welcomed positive feedback from these issues. Abandoned projects, as a result, were discovered and completed. Shoulder work on government contracts was addressed, and also citizen engagement with these processes improved. And this resulted into community ownership of government projects. In a number of schools, for example, here in Uganda, in addition to what government was building, communities, as a result of this engagement, were able to mobilize own resources and build things like teachers' houses, staff room, kitchen, among others. So access to information and participation helps to raise ownership of government projects. We have also advocated for strengthening of disclosure of procurement information on respective portals. For example, in Uganda, Kenya, Malawi, Nigeria, and Ghana. And we have analyzed this data based on a number of indicators. For example, levels of disclosure, levels of efficiency, levels of inclusiveness, time and cost overruns, among others. And based on this, we have provided feedback to government. Now, in Uganda, for example, one of the findings was that in the health sector, government had lost over 172 billion shillings in inflated costs. We found high levels of inefficiency in the tendering process, that instead of a procurement process taking an average of 110 days for local contracts, it was taking 182. That is the average. And 372 days for international bidding, among others. For women, youth, and persons with disabilities, we found that this data was not being captured in a gender segregated manner. And through this engagement, a number of countries now, Uganda has at least redesigned the government procurement to capture this data, although the entities, procuring entities, have not yet started filling that field.
Thank you.
Finally,
thank you very much, Gilbert. Sorry, I'm going to pause you there so that we can make sure we hear from Arantxa on the first question as well. And thank you so much for giving so many rich examples of how citizen engagement not only serves to strengthen the public spending and the value for money of that spending, but really make sure that there is locally rooted and driven ownership of development projects. We will come back to you on that more in our second round of questions for sure. So next, I want to turn to Arantxa from UNDESA to talk a little bit about the work that you're doing on audits and how that kind of comes into this process as well and can help us strengthen overall public financial management.
I will try to get as close to the mic as my size allows. So thank you very much, Kristen, for the introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here today, and thank you to Open Contracting Partnership and the International Budget Partnership for the invitation and the opportunity to join all of you this morning. So my name is Arantxa Guilla-Montero. I'm a Senior Governance and Public Administration Officer at the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, UNDESA. And UNDESA, through its Division for Public Institutions and Digital Government, has a long and well-established collaboration with national audit offices, Supreme Audit Institutions, and with the International Organization of Supreme Audit Institutions, INTOSAI. As you may know, Supreme Audit institutions are explicitly recognized in the Addis Agenda, and there are different General Assembly resolutions that recognize also the contribution of Supreme Audit institutions to having effective public administration and to address sustainable development challenges. And we have seen also in the discussions during this week that the role of Supreme Audit institutions has also been reflected in the Elements paper, although briefly. So since 2016, UNDESA has been working with Supreme Audit institutions around their contribution to the implementation and the follow-up and review of the SDGs. And of course, strengthening public financial management systems and procurement processes and ensuring the effective use of public resources is critical for delivering on the Sustainable Development Goals. In this context, we have been working with Supreme Audit institutions in two different areas which are relevant for our discussions today. The first one is on budget credibility issues, and we have collaborated with 8 Supreme Audit institutions from different countries and with the International Budget Partnership in developing a handbook on strengthening the credibility of government budgets through external audits. The handbook documents and provides examples of different ways in which Supreme Audit institutions around the world are examining and auditing issues related to budget credibility, reflects on some of the challenges of this work, some of the lessons learned, and also provide tips and recommendations for strengthening the contribution of Supreme Audit institutions and external audits to strengthening budget credibility. A second area of work is related with procurement. So we have collaborated with the Intosai Development Initiative in developing guidance for Supreme Audit institutions and for auditors to audit the implementation of the SDGs, of specific targets. And this guidance was published initially in 2020, and a revised version was published earlier this year in July 2024. And this guidance has been applied to support different audits of SDG implementation around the world. And one of the areas has been on supporting audits on sustainable public procurement, SDG target 12.7. There was an audit conducted by 14 Supreme Audit institutions in Latin America and the Caribbean. And there was a regional report which was published in 2022 with some of the results of the audits that have been conducted at the national level. So why this work with Supreme Audit institutions and how this is relevant to the discussions during this week and today? So what we have seen in the PFN discussions and the financing for development discussions, that there is still a gap regarding accountability and oversight issues, and there is still a lack of understanding also of how Supreme Audit institutions, how external auditors can contribute to our understanding of issues related with the credibility of budgets, with improving the performance of PFM systems, improving procurement processes. But at the same time, as it has been highlighted by some of the previous speakers, it is a key element in national systems. Supreme Audit institution, external auditors have a critical role to play in providing in-country analysis, information, and data that can be used with information provided by other stakeholders, by civil society, by government entities, by internal auditors, by experts and international organizations to identify some of the challenges in how PFN systems work, in how procurement processes work, but also the power of Supreme Audit institutions is that they can make recommendations. Many of them, according to their mandate, can make recommendations for governments to address these challenges. So we see that they have a critical role to play to improve the performance of PFM systems and to make sure that they deliver to citizens in terms of national development objectives, including the SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arantxa, for that and for sharing a bit with us what UNDESA is doing on this agenda and how you're bringing in the role of Supreme Audit institutions. I think it's great that we've had an opening remark from all of our panelists, really looking at the full chain of public financial management. So I wanted to do another round of interventions from them, really looking at, I suppose there's two questions on my mind. I'll package them together for all of you. When we look at the elements paper and we look at the domestic resource mobilization section, also when we look at the science and technology section, when we're thinking about the data and the tech platforms we're using to often intermediate and share this information with the citizens, there are some things a number of us have noticed that are missing. How we get greater public participation in public financial management across budget, procurement, and audit, and how we do that using open data, using access to information. So I would like to hear from the panelists, in your experience, what has worked in using digital platforms to engage the public, what hasn't worked, and maybe there are some things that we can learn from those reflections that could be useful inputs going forward from the elements paper. And I will start by going back to Gabriel from budget.
Okay, thank you very much, Christine. And I think, as much as we still have a whole bunch of issues around budget, procurement, audits, we must also be able to identify that some things have worked and are working, even though if they are not delivering the desirable results yet. One thing that stand out, and I heard Gilbert also mentioning about 29 African countries have law that facilitate access to information, right? I guess that is a basis, right? Because that then guarantees that, citizens, CSOs, media, journalists can request certain information about budgets, right? Yes, the promptness of, using digital platform to share information. If I use the case of Nigeria, we have a situation now where, when budget is passed or is presented or is signed into law, after a while, it will be publicly available on the website of the Budget Office of the Federation, right? And that was why I said some things have worked, some have not worked. We still have to deal with issues of presenting budget documents in over 2,000, 3,000 copies in PDF, right? And then you then have to employ either additional digital tool to be able to, mine that into a machine-readable format, or you want to use informal means to be able to get the machine-readable format. Those are some issues that we are still dealing with, and I will come to that. But also another thing that have worked is, the level of citizen education, right? One thing that we have done, part of the work that we do, budgets in Nigeria and in other countries where we have operations, is that when budget is passed into law, even before procurement starts, before disbursement of funds starts, we have created a system where we sensitize the community. We go ahead into the community, we share budget information in smaller pamphlets, right, about maybe their municipal or their constituency, to inform them ahead of project that will be done in their environment, road that is meant to be fixed, school that is meant to be repaired, and things like that. So they have expectations. We empower them with information, because one thing we also realized is what makes corruption to thrive is access to information, right? People in government hold on to information. The more they can hold on to information, the more corruption can be perpetrated. So we destabilize that process by ensuring that we empower citizens with information. And we have had wonderful cases where, citizens have been, communities have been informed or educated about a school building that is going to come to their community. They have an expectation that it's going to be 6 blocks of classroom, is going to have this facility and that facility, and then contractor come to site and they see from what the contractor is doing that the contractor is putting 3 blocks of classroom in place, and they're able to approach the contractor with the information that they have, right, and with the sensitization that they have right to ask questions, to say, oh, we are aware that you are meant to give us 6 blocks of classrooms in this place. This is the budget document. This is the amount. But what you are doing does not seem to meet up with 6. And there are instances where contractors have had to go back to the government agency or whoever commissioned the project because the people are now informed and the contractor come back to site and do the right thing. Another thing that I've worked is also digital portal. One of the things that Nigerian government did in 2019 was to launch a portal that is called the Open Treasury Portal. Right, and that Open Treasury Portal is a portal launched by the government of Nigeria to share information about every daily spending from National Treasury above certain threshold, which is reasonable, 5 million naira and above, right? And by that singular platform, right, it's radicalized access to information about procurement, about budget implementation, because from that platform now you have access to information like how much has been paid on a particular line item, who was paid, what is left, and you get those granular details. And the interesting thing with the work that we do as a civil society organization is, while that portal is beautiful, I mean, the information, the idea is beautiful, but using it is still problematic, right? So an average journalist or another CSO may not be able to make good use of the information. That we were then able to build another platform on that platform that we call the GovSpend, that goes into the government Open Treasury Portal, crawl the data, and make it machine readable. So with that, you can then go on GovSpend and search, a keyword about a project, or search a keyword about a contractor, and it will even give you historical data about a particular. So that is one of the things we are doing. Anytime we now identify a contractor that delivered a shoddy project, right, we are then able to use the GovSpend to search that contractor, and then it can give us historical data about all the projects that particular contractor has collected from government before. And then we can do an on-spot checking to see the quality of those projects, and we can even lead a campaign for blacklisting of such contractor, so that we can begin to take issues around budgets just away. Looking at government only is narrow. Private sector are also enabling this system that is not working. And so just focusing on government alone will be missing out a lot. Contractors are private sectors, and we have also devised means of being able to call them out. But I think generally, talking about what hasn't worked, top on my list will be the power of the parliament. Right? The parliament have so much power because the parliament is the representative of the people in government. What we have seen is that the parliament most of the time mess up the credibility of budgets, right? Where the executive, with its power, has prepared a budget, presents it to the parliament as constitutionally demanded, but it goes into the parliament, and then the parliament, with their own power to review, right? And I guess that is because Constitution did not restrict that power to review. So it's a blanket power to review. And then by the time the budget is coming out from the parliament, it has been distorted. It's not speaking to development or the national development plan or the agenda of the administration. So top of my list would be the power of the parliament. If the parliaments use their power right, particularly around budget reviews, to be able to create enough room for engagement, for public hearing, for consultation, we are going to see improvements in our budgets. The credibility of budgets we improve, and then even public expenditure, the efficiency will also significantly improve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. And you've mentioned a lot of great points there, including on the struggle with PDFs, which I think many of us know is very real and very difficult to work with. And the platforms that you're building in Nigeria, I think, really show how, and we see this at OCP across a number of countries, where civil society or civic tech organizations are able to use data and turn it into a more user-friendly platform that sometimes even governments start to use because it is easier easier for them to track, to look for red flags, or to look, for example, across government departments. It's no good having a debarment list if the health agency doesn't know which companies have been debarred already from the education department and so on. So I'm going to turn now to Mylène on this same question to tell us a little bit about what's worked and what hasn't, and also the role of digital technology in your work.
Yes, thanks. I think I just want to echo what my brother just said about the context of how they use this in their work in Nigeria. I think indeed the role of the private sector has to be emphasized. But to come back to your question, while we think that the public information platforms or just generally public information being available is an opportunity, one interesting thing we have noted with one of our programs, which is called Budget Credibility, is that most of the time that is not sufficient for several reasons. The first reason being that the information is not exhaustive. If we look at countries like Senegal or South Africa, in which we work, or Indonesia, the second thing being that we don't have a lot of granularity around the information. And some contracts are not being published in some countries like Senegal. And the third thing is, the question of access to internet, the question of language, people having access to a good connection and being able to use the documents is something that we've also identified as being a problem. And one final thing that we think is important to raise is the fact that the data may not always be data that is actionable, which has led us to developing a lot of alternative data, which we have tried to push for government to use. But in the midst of this situation, we said, how do we work in an adaptive manner at the International Budget Partnership? So one thing was to invest a lot in training, but joint trainings between government and citizens to see where the loopholes are and how we can find joint ways of addressing, public procurement related questions, especially the question of oversight and monitoring. The second thing is, while we were building a base of CSOs, community facilitators, and movements, bringing in oversight agencies. In Senegal, we have a regulatory agency when it comes to procurement. But in addition to that, the Supreme Audit Institution has started developing performance audits, which will look at the availability of information, so the question of transparency and timeliness of the publication, but also look at the performance of the different programs that we have. Something we found very important was also developing policy dialogues, because the premise that civil society organizations have is that government is not publishing information for XYZ reasons. But sometimes it is a matter of bureaucracy or a matter of need to be trained on those questions. So we play that middleman role between government and communities. While raising the awareness of the supply side, we empower the demand side on using those. And the result of all this work is being used for advocacy purposes, which lead to, changes in rules, in practices, in implementation, in valuing citizens-generated data, in, complementing government information with the information that is available at the local level. But that also, teaches us what the gaps are when it comes to making sure that public procurements work for the poor, the marginalized, and the most vulnerable. I insist on those because that is where our strategy focuses. So I think procurement is an element of transparency. As long as the information that we have is disaggregated, is available on time, and is exhaustive, which is one of the challenges we have been seeing. One alternative ways of addressing this was also developing within communities the capacity to develop data. At the beginning, that was not really admitted and accepted by government. But the more we push with credibility, the more we said the budget execution rate that you announced does not translate in the services that we see, the more we had opportunities for citizens to say the maternity yard is not built, or, for example, in countries like Nigeria, the immunization funds are not producing the outcomes that are expected. And the more we've been able to bring, journalists in this discussion, the more we've been able to have the Supreme Audit Institution lean into the question, we've created an environment of accountability, not only around the transparency and availability of information around public procurement, but the outputs and the outcomes of public procurement. So now we are working towards a new agenda, which is using public procurement as a means to empower economically those who are marginalized, because we have a quota system that is in the Senegal public procurement law, but that unfortunately a lot of people don't know. And that is the reason why I've insisted on not only training, both on government and civil society side, but making sure that there are spaces for dialogue around the information that is available and the information that should be available.
Thank you very much for that, Milen, and thank you again for reiterating the importance of the private sector. I think it's becoming clear to me hearing our interventions that this isn't a civil society versus government conversation. It's really looking at all of the different people and stakeholders in society who can benefit from the rich value of information on budgets and contracting and the opportunities that creates for job creation, for economic growth, and so on. So I'm going to hand over to Gilbert to tell us a little bit about what he's seeing in terms of what's working and what's not in this space, and the role of technology and perhaps private sector as well, since that's coming through as a strong theme.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the first thing that we have to note here is that there has been increase in disclosure, proactive disclosure of government information, especially around public procurement. And this has helped us a great deal, us and other CSOs working on accountability issues, because our tools then are able to access this information or fetch it from these portals and then analyze it easily. And then this helps us then to give quality and timely feedback to various government agencies, whether they are ministries, departments, and agencies that are implementing or those on the accountability side. It also then helps us to know where the highest risks are and what needs to be done. So that has helped, disclosure empowering, the use of technology and quality and timely feedback. The other thing that we see is improved government trust and use of the tools that we have developed in monitoring contracts. For example, some of the tools that we have are linked with government systems so that when our community monitors identify issues on contracts, they're able to directly make a complaint or report to the relevant government agency. So it is improving and becoming more and more seamless. What I think should be noted, though, is that what governments do and citizens do is really largely dependent on the quality and engagement of accountability CSOs. But then, as you know, increasingly there is increasing civic space on the continent where we work, affecting the ease and ability of accountability CSOs to operate, secure funding, even donors to support this work. We have seen a lot of decline, which is a major area of concern. On what has not worked well is that whereas there has been increased disclosure and whereas there has been a bit of increased data use, I think there is more that needs to be done to promote data use. There is a lot that is not being done on using data which has been disclosed to strengthen accountability. Also, government's ability to consistently and regularly disclose needs to be strengthened. For example, in Uganda, which really took leadership role on the continent in disclosing procurement information, we have seen a decline, tremendous decline in levels of disclosure. So there's need to be more consistent and continue disclosing. And this is also the case with Malawi and other countries. And then the other challenge is about the, when the feedback is brings out significant issues around maybe fraud. Sometimes we have found, companies with the same telephone address, same physical address, originated on the same data and received by the government agencies on similar dates. Sometimes these kinds of issues receive, cause some level of discomfort. I think there's need for recognition that feedback, whether difficult or good, is good feedback, and all the agencies should receive it positively. So those are some of the things that have worked and others that have not worked well. But I think they need also to invest in data use, including the tools, including the spaces, needs to be done, because governments have done well on improving disclosure, but then the quality of feedback could be better if this was being used. And maybe before I end, one of the other things is that, and I think most important, is what we have learned, that government acts on evidence. Our research on barriers and solutions to women's participation in public procurement revealed that whereas government spend over 60% of the national budget through public procurement, women-owned businesses take less than 1% due to lack of enabling policies and affirmative action, lack of capacity, lack of access to information, among others. Now, with this information, Rwanda, Uganda, and Ethiopia have amended procurement laws to address some of the policy issues. Kenya has put up a committee of cabinet to review delayed payments, which was a major barrier in Kenya. And Tanzania has initiated awareness and training programs for women-owned businesses. So I think government openness to act on evidence has been, for us, one of the key important areas that have worked well. And in Uganda, where they have set up a public procurement policy forum with CSOs, donors, government agencies, and regulators meeting every 3 months, and also allowing civil society to make official statements on that, has also been one of the key areas that facilitate constructive engagement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gilbert. And I love that you concluded your remarks talking about Uganda's public procurement policy forum and the way that really brings together all of these stakeholders to have an openness to acting on evidence and improving the way that we're making sure procurement serves the development goals, and it's a market that really creates meaningful jobs and is more inclusive. I'm going to turn to Arantxa to look at the audit side, and curious to hear what you think is working well, what could be improved, and the role of data and technology in the work you're doing there.
Thank you. Yes, there are things that are working well, as Gabriel has indicated, and I think we have seen in the work we have done in these two areas that I outlined before, we have seen examples of positive results, examples of change also in government action, examples of change in how different stakeholders work together. For example, in the work on sustainable public procurement in Costa Rica, the audit conducted really played a pivotal role to enable changes in the legal framework, which culminated in having a general law on public procurement enacted in 2022, and the General Controller of Costa Rica conducted an assessment of the institutional readiness of different public entities to implement the law. In Guatemala, the audit resulted in, for the first time, having a digital platform providing a digital dashboard, providing granular information on public procurement processes, and also contributed to strengthen the existing program on sustainable public procurement. In Dominican Republic and Chile, the audit helped to facilitate a dialogue and engagement between the Supreme Audit Institution and public entities working on public procurement, but also with the private sector providers in those countries. And one of the key factors to facilitate that dialogue was also that the Supreme Audit Institution was perceived as a very trustworthy partner, as an independent actor in the country context that could provide an independent assessment and view and information. On the budget credibility side, we have also seen examples of positive results, also in many different countries, different regions. In countries like Ireland, the work of the Supreme Audit Institution contributed to improving the accounting procedures in central government, but also bringing financial documentation and information more in line with international standards. In countries like Peru and Kenya, civil society and Supreme Audit institutions have been working together also to use the results of audits to strengthen budget credibility and to address challenges in PFM systems and processes. We have also examples in countries like Peru and Guatemala where Supreme Audit institutions have been engaging and collaborating with citizens also to do monitoring of the execution of public projects, for example, infrastructure, directly on the field, and also providing digital tools and platforms for citizens and civil society to be able to report irregularities and information that can help the Supreme Audit institution identify risk, for example, of corruption or fraud in the execution of those projects. So there are many different examples of change, and I think it's important to look at these examples to identify some of the elements that may have worked, but also some of the challenges. And I would like to highlight a few challenges on the audit side, but also some that relate with the engagement with the stakeholders. I think one first challenge is that we still need to raise awareness of Supreme Audit institutions and auditors regarding public financial management and the role and how audits can inform improving the performance of PFM, improving the performance of procurement processes. Another challenge, I think it has to do also with capacity. Of course, the community of Supreme Audit institutions is very diverse, and they have different mandates, capacities, resources, country context. I think it's important also to strengthen the capacity of auditors to audit PFM issues, to do budget evaluation, to do performance audit. As in the case of Senegal, many Supreme Audit institutions are still in that process of improving their capacities to conduct performance audits and not only look at these issues through compliance or financial audits, but also bring in that opportunity to identify some of the challenges and the barriers to improve outcomes and to improve the results that are delivered to citizens. Another challenge I think has to do with systems. with having strong, sound systems to follow up and to monitor the implementation of audit recommendations. And of course, many supreme audit institutions and leveraging ICTs and data and new technologies and digitalization to do this. But of course, as governments also face their own challenges in mobilizing data and new technologies, supreme audit institutions face similar challenges as well. And we have supreme audit institutions at very different levels of maturity in using these opportunities that technology and data analytics bring. And I think we have a challenge also related with the communication of audit findings. And I think it's important also that in this case, civil society and citizens and different stakeholders to work with auditors and supreme audit institutions to communicate the audit findings in plain language in a way that speaks to the needs and the demands of citizens in their own countries, and also to have a more strategic approach to communication and how auditors communicate and engage with different stakeholders. And I think of course, supreme audit institutions have a lot of things that they can do, but also there are other stakeholders that have the role to play. And I think it's important to create a shared understanding of PFM issues, of budget issues between different stakeholders, to speak the same language, to create a mutual trust between the different stakeholders, so there can be also some common ground to address some of the issues at the country level.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Arantxa, and thank you to all of our panelists for being so forthcoming on sharing not just what's working well that we should be doing more of, but also what some of the challenges are, because it's always really important to understand what we need to do differently going forward. I'm going to come back to all of our panelists for a closing remark, but we do have some time for questions first. So I wanted to open the floor to the room. If you're in the room, please turn your microphone on and wait for it to go red. If you are online, if you could put your question on the chat, type it. My colleague Sally from IBP will pass it my way. Any questions? Anyone want to go first?
Thanks. Thank you to all the panelists for your interventions. My name is Aisling. I'm from the Mission of Ireland, and it's really useful to hear all of your interventions and lots of positives, I think, as well as the challenges. I'd be interested maybe just in your recommendations for what you want to see in the FFD outcome document in terms of this work. Where do you see maybe hooks in the elements paper or lacks in the elements paper that could be built upon over the next couple of months? Thank you.
So much, Aisling. Any other? I might take 2 or 3 if there's any other questions here. Is there any?
Thank you to all the panelists. We have a question that's been coming up in terms of what specifically we see different in the global financing framework from national financing frameworks, and I guess how this agenda connects with global financing frameworks, if you have any thoughts on that. Any others online? And please, anyone who's online, go ahead and put your questions in the chat, and I'm happy to relay them on, but that's all we've got for now.
Okay, I will turn back to our panelists to address those 2 questions. I'll start with Gabriel. Go ahead and answer either one that you feel.
Yes, let me pick on the recommendations for finance for development. And I know that, with the issues around capacity of government to generate enough revenue, there's still a whole lot that many governments of nations are doing with debt, and borrowing continues, and we don't see it ending. In the case of Nigeria, for example, we have cases of almost every quarter there is one new borrowing that is happening or the other. And if there will be any recommendation I would like to make into the FFD document, it is for government, on the side of the government, and then on the side of the international or the global community giving the facility. On the side of the government is that there should be more disclosure around debt. There should be efficiency of what we are using debt for, right? There should be a clear indicator that ensures that debt is not invested in consumption, but is invested in initiative that makes it easy to replicate itself. I mean, up until 2020, up until last year, Nigeria spent almost 100% of its revenue generation as a nation in debt servicing, leaving no room for funding to go into capital expenditure and public expenditure, right? So we then see that for government to invest in public spending, in capital spending, they have to do more borrowings because practically all internally generated revenue goes back into debt servicing, right? So let's see debt service that's debt that is more disclosed and is used for efficient purposes. Then on the part of the global community giving out the facility, I think we have an example that have worked, and I want to quote the example is from the World Bank, right? Not too long ago, the World Bank implemented a program in Nigeria and I believe in other countries that is called the SIFTAS, Strengthening Fiscal Transparency and Accountability System, something like that. And the SIFTAS worked for us by our assessment because it was an incentivized program that incentivized certain action from government. So loan were not just given to, and this was even from national government to subnational government, wasn't just released. It was released on certain metrics and conditions, right? They have certain numbers of what they call direct linked indicators, right? So things around, and that significantly and radically transformed subnational transparency and accountability because that program tied every indicators for transparency to certain amounts. So if you release your budget to the public before the 31st of January, if you approve your budget before the 31st of January of a given year, you are qualified for a particular amount. If you make it publicly available on your website before the 31st of January of a given year, you are qualified for a particular amount. If you go ahead to simplify the budget and produce a citizen's version, simplified version of your budget before the 30th of April of the given year, you are qualified for a particular amount. If you make your financial statement available by the end of June of a given year, you were qualified for another amount. And they did that program for 5 years. And at the end of 5 years, I can sit here and tell you that particular program has radically transformed subnational transparency and accountability in Nigeria. Proud to that time, proud to the program, you can have a whole year that out of 36 subnational province or states in Nigeria, a whole year you may not be able to find up to 10 approved budget of subnational government. But that singular program of the World Bank radicalized it and made it happen. And today I can tell you, sitting here, this is 2024, December, I can tell you that we have access to all audited financial statements of all the 36 state governments. And it came out by the end of July. Because even though the program has ended now, the gain, civil society organizations like us were now able to sustain the gain of such a program. So if international community, the IMF of this world, the World Bank, is giving facilities to state government or to national government, can we tie that facility, can we make it conditional to certain development indicators, right? And there are quite a number of them that we are still grappling with, and that would be my recommendation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I'll turn to our participants online, starting with Milen for his thoughts on these two questions. Just to remind, they were recommendations for the elements paper and what we want to see in the outcome document in Sevilla. And also, how the national financing frameworks and PFN tie into the global financial framework.
Yes, thanks. Very shortly on the second question, I think that processes like this one are very important, where we try and collect information from uh, local governments to national governments, from national governments to the international scene, that will help the global financial architecture be in line with the ongoing challenges that are faced by the countries, but most importantly, by those for whom we say that we develop their budgets. On the other question, I guess civil society is often constrained by our ability to effectively monitor government spending because of lack of information and limitations to how many CSOs and community groups can use, budget information. So the question of data, the question of organizing communities, and the question of raising performance audits and oversight in the agenda is very important. I think there are very interesting things that are happening both in trying to make resources more available to countries, support development plans, etc. But one of the challenges we have seen across countries is building an internal accountability ecosystem. So I guess several recommendations on my end. The first question is really surfacing the question of intergenerational debt equity. We have been seeing something looking like a debt crisis in the past years in a lot of the countries in which we work. And we've realized that one of the questions that is not being asked is, are we going to leave a country that is in a best place than it was before we borrowed the resources we're borrowing, and what that implies for the future generations? The second thing is, how do we make sure that gender and climate are not just nice to have? We've been seeing them at the local level in a lot of policies, also coming from a lot of our donors. But when it comes to implementation, just as what we raised on procurement, there is least scrutiny around those questions of climate integration, protection of the rights of populations, gender and intersectionality being looked at. The third thing would be to emphasize on the need for donors to align to the local procurement systems. One challenge that we have also seen across the countries we work with is a lot of donors or international partners have developed different procurement processes and approaches, which, in addition to the local or the governmental procurement procedures, make it a bit more cumbersome to understand and to read. So just making sure that development financing also is mainstreamed in the local procurement approaches and processes. And maybe one last thing would be to keep insisting in building the oversight actors, such as when you have a regulatory agency like in Senegal, or when you have a supreme audit institution that, beyond its role to oversee budget execution and conformity, is willing to look at the question of performance. Make sure that these audit institutions are brought into the process. The reason being that if we speak about public debts, if we speak about the efficiency of public expenditure, what we are looking at is the quality of the spending. And we all know that when you get resources that don't get to the people that are supposed to get them, then it's a loss. And when you have borrowed resources to develop a specific service or a specific infrastructure, and they don't go there, or they don't fully go there, you don't develop enough capital to pay your debt and improve the lives of the citizens. So I guess this accountability ecosystem that will favor the participation of the supreme audit institutions, looking at the sectors also where we have a lot of inefficiencies, would be great. And the last thing is keep building the field and supporting non-governmental organizations in their diversity, and providing tailored assistance and support to governments and non-governmental actors depending on the needs that they have, but also taking into account their limitations and the opportunities that we may have to engage with them.
Thank you, Milen. And now I'll turn to our other online panelist for the same, Gilbert.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll combine a response to the two questions. We have seen that affirmative agenda is improving and increasing at policy level, but then implementation is challenged. For example, Tanzania adopted a reservation scheme for women, youth, persons with disabilities, and the elderly to get access to government contracts. But then since 2016 up to now, up the time we did our research in 2021, nobody had won contracts under that scheme because of capacities in implementation, but also capacities on the demand side. So I think there is need to prioritize and increase investment in the what you call special groups to participate in government opportunities, especially those around public procurement. We have seen Kenya has this law now, Uganda, Rwanda, Ethiopia, but then implementation is challenged. So I think that needs prioritization. And for the countries which don't have this yet, should do so, because if you have government spending over 60% of the national budget every year through public procurement, for example, but then these groups take less than 1%, you can't address inequality. So for me, that is not only important, but urgent. Secondly, we need to see, we have seen from our evidence that the quality of delivery of government programs and the value that comes from them is dependent on the quality of citizen engagement. Where citizen engagement has been done and feedback provided, we have seen significant improvements, but also addressing leakages and inefficiencies. And yet, many of the development partners don't prioritize this. The World Bank has a policy on this, but then implementation is challenged according to the monitoring that we did. So if all development partners and government investments can prioritize citizen engagement, it will make a huge, huge difference. And finally, on the health and the capacity and space for CSOs, 3 weeks ago, a government agency responsible for overseeing CSOs in Uganda said that the number of civil society has reduced from 14,000 in 2019 to 5,021 in 2023. So you can see the mortality rate is very high, not just, and this is not only in Uganda, but across the continent where we work. So, and yet, the role of CSOs is very, very important. So I think prioritization of, making sure that there's a good policy environment for CSOs to operate, making sure that they are properly and adequately funded, making sure that they have the tools, the space, and ability to mobilize citizens to engage with the various stakeholders is going to be very, very critical. Now, you can imagine if an organization that has been working, let's say for 10 years, dies with its capacity, bringing another one to that level is going to be very difficult. So it is a loss for everyone, donors, governments, and of course, citizens themselves. So I think this one also needs urgent attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gilbert, for your thoughts on both of those questions. And I will turn to Arantxa, our final panelist, for her thoughts on both of those.
Thank you. and thank you for the questions here in the room and also online. So on the question regarding the global financing framework and the national financing frameworks, I agree with what Marlene just said in terms of the importance of these processes and the discussions we are having here during this week, and we will be having until mid next year. So I think it's important to emphasize that the global financing framework and the global financing architecture reflects what are the needs and the challenges that have been identified, that are identified by member states and stakeholders at the national level. So they actually, those challenges, those needs, those demands are what the member states and stakeholders are bringing here during the discussions. And of course, what comes out of those discussions it's difficult also a negotiation in terms of what can be in and out to have a global framework that has some consensus and can be agreed by all the different parties at the table. But then also when we have that agreement, and of course if you see at what will come out of these discussions that have been starting during these months, it's also a way to address some of the gaps that we have identified over time compared to the Addis agenda. So the discussions evolve over time, also depending on how a national context is changing, how the global context is changing. But also when we have this global financing framework architecture in place, it has an effect and an impact in terms of driving the discussions and processes at the national level. And I will give an example also in terms of what it means for Supreme Audit institutions and national audit officers. So Supreme Audit institutions, of course, their mandate is at the national level, and they are able to provide information and to identify many of the challenges that are happening in PFN systems regarding debt, regarding revenue generation and mobilization, regarding effective spending and effective budget implementation. And that information can be brought into these discussions regarding how to address those challenges through global mechanisms as well. And they can provide relevant information also to follow up and to monitor on the commitments that governments made in the context of the global framework. At the same time, when we have this global framework in place and this global architecture, Supreme Audit institutions and other oversight institutions, actors at the national level, different stakeholders, can also use this global framework and architecture to demand also action on those commitments that have been adopted at the global level. So it's mutually reinforcing. So that's why the discussions that member states and stakeholders are having during these weeks and in the coming months are so critical and so important to strengthening also what is happening at the national level. Regarding the outcome document and the elements paper, of course, as part of the Secretariat of the UN, it's not for me to decide or identify what should be there. I think it's for member states and stakeholders to decide. But I think there have been very interesting discussions during the week in terms of some of the tensions and the challenges that we are seeing regarding the financing for development framework, issues related with, and some have been mentioned by the previous speakers, how we incorporate these more specific areas around gender or around climate into the global financing framework. How would we bring also the perspective of specific vulnerable groups, also specific vulnerabilities in groups of countries. Also, the issue of the intergenerational perspective that Marlene indicated, issues regarding citizen engagement and participation that have not been emphasized so much in the current draft. And of course, from the accountability perspective, I think there is also important elements that could be discussed. There are some references to audit, as I said before, and to the role of Supreme Audit institutions, but also maybe more from the perspective of the independence of Supreme Audit institutions, which is critical because it's one of the enabling factors. But I think it's important also to bring the value that they can deliver in terms of providing information on many of these areas, in terms of revenue mobilization, in terms of public debt, in terms of effective spending, and effective service delivery. So I think those are some of the areas that could be further discussed.
Thank you very much, Arantxa, and thank you to all of our panelists and to everyone following online and everyone in the room. Given time, I'm just going to do a quick concluding remark that also touches on the elements paper and the connection between the global and domestic financing frameworks. We hear in a lot of development spaces, not just at the FFD, but for example, in the climate space and other development fora, the IDA replenishment that was taking place in South Korea this week, about country platforms. And I think it's really important to recognize that the domestic policy is how the ambition of the global financing framework is then implemented. And when we look at the elements paper and how it can create an enabling environment for that to happen effectively, I think for this conversation, there's three key areas. One is domestic resource mobilization, and currently in the elements paper, a lot of these policy areas are mentioned, but in a bit more of a compliance or tick list way, I would say, instead of really the strategic change in approach of how we can look at these things, and also the public participation in human-centered design and the bottom-up as well as top-down. The second is international cooperation. I think the role of the IFIs is huge. The World Bank released a report that it had an independent analysis done of its public procurement practices just a month ago, and the big message from those independent procurement expert evaluators was we're creating parallel systems. We're not strengthening the systems that we should be. Ukraine has done things very differently recently with their DREAM platform, with all of the aid coming in for reconstruction, where they have been the first, to my knowledge, the only time this has happened, where there is one platform that all of the development banks, all of the bilateral donors are using to, and that platform also has connected with regional and local governments to ask communities what their reconstruction needs are, so that there are not all of these different competing systems created. And that creates a lot of friction and a lot of, it makes it harder to understand the aid effectiveness. So I think we could do a lot to strengthen the international cooperation section of the elements paper, looking at these kind of innovations and how we have better donor coordination, how we think more strategically about the governance-linked, the disbursement-linked indicators that Gabriel mentioned. I don't know that they're mentioned in the elements paper right now, but it's, we hear a lot of pushback from governments on conditionalities. Sometimes it's like, what are the conditionalities that are useful, and what are the ones that are not and that are creating harm? And then finally, on science and technology, I think there isn't enough focus there on open data, digital public goods, all of the digital systems. We released a report evaluating 5 digital transformations of public procurement in the African region alone and what went wrong with them. So I think that section of the elements paper could be strengthened as well, with some real concrete lessons learned on what we should be doing over the next decade to use data and tech better for development. And with that, I would love to thank everyone for joining us and welcome you all to stay in touch and continue the conversation between now and Sevilla.
Thank you.
Thank you.